Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to this evening's CF Live event, which is all about mindful eating. So my name's Jacqueline. I work in the information and support team at the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, and I'm really pleased to be here with you all. And I just wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to the evening event before I hand over to our speakers. So we do have quite a small turnout this evening. It'll be a bit more of an intimate event than we're used to, but please do feel free to say hello in the chat if you're comfortable doing so. And please do also feel free to put any questions that you have for your speakers, for our speakers this evening. And the event will be recorded. It'll be added to our YouTube channel afterwards. So please do feel free to watch it later and to share with anyone who you think it might be useful for afterwards. So for anyone who doesn't know, this event is part of a mini series we've been running on CF and nutrition. So this is the 6th event, I believe, in a series of 7. So we have our final one next month. We actually launched the series back in August last year with a kind of opening event, which was an overview of how nutritional care and treatment is evolving in CF. And since then, we've had a really diverse kind of program of events on topics such as CF and modulators, CF diabetes and nutrition, and also eating well on a budget. So you can go back onto our YouTube channel and catch up on all of those. So this event is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear on camera, please turn your video off. And in terms of the format of this evening's event, it's a little bit different. We don't have a full panel discussion this evening, but we do have 2 expert speakers this evening who'll be presenting. And then we'll move on to some questions that have been submitted in advance when some of you have registered. But as I said, if you do have any questions that occur to you as we go along, please do pop them in the chat and we'll try and answer them after our speakers have given their presentations. So I'm really pleased now to welcome our 2 speakers. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Helen Egan. And Helen is a professor in health psychology at Birmingham City University. And I'm also really pleased to welcome Katie Marsden, and Katie is a specialist CF dietitian at the West Midlands Adult Cystic Fibrosis Centre. So a very warm welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for taking time out this evening to be here with us. And I'm now going to hand over to Helen to get us started with her slide. So over to you, Helen.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. It's a very short presentation, so it won't be death by PowerPoint. Hopefully it will be interesting. So, okay, can everybody see that?
We can.
Okay, fantastic. So I work as part of a research team at Birmingham City University, and I've worked for over 8 years, nearly 9 years now, with different CF teams and CF clinicians, and I work alongside Michael Mancios, who has a long background in mindful eating, mindfulness and mindful eating. So we've been working really to look at mindful eating and how it can be useful for lots of different populations, but particularly for populations of people with cystic fibrosis. Just trying to get onto my next slide. So when we talk about mindful eating, in its very sort of pure form, mindful eating is defined as a sustained attention to the sensory element of the eating experience. So the taste of the food that you're eating, and really importantly, a non-judgmental or non-evaluative awareness of thoughts and feelings that aren't related to those sensory elements of the eating experience in that present moment. So this is our definition of mindful eating and what that actually means to eat mindfully in the moment of consuming that food. So when you're in the act of mindful eating, it's really thinking about paying attention to what your food looks like, what your food smells like, and what your food tastes like. And we know from the work that we've done that sometimes people have difficulties with tasting food or difficulties with smelling food. So we can also focus on different elements of that. So maybe the texture of food or what your food looks like, and just focusing on one of those anchors can be helpful. So if you really struggle to taste food well or to smell food very well, then you can think about other elements of that food. It doesn't have to be tasting, or it doesn't have to be taste. Really importantly, it's really having a non-judgmental awareness of thoughts and feelings that aren't focused on those sensory elements of the eating experience. So when you are thinking about smelling your food or tasting your food, invariably, well, for me, and I'm sure for everybody else, invariably your mind goes to different things. So even when you're trying to focus on the food, your mind runs to, did I unload the washing machine? Did I pick the shopping up? Have I done something? Is my child doing their homework? All kinds of other things that aren't related to that food. And that's completely normal and human. And part of mindful eating is just being aware of that and then putting your thoughts back to the sensory elements of the eating experience and really not giving yourself a hard time. It's not about judging those thoughts or thinking that you failed, or I'm not very good at this, or I've done it again, but just to say to yourself, I've had a thought or I've had a feeling, and then refocusing your attention on the meal that you're eating. And it does get easier with practice. It can be quite difficult to start off with, but like everything else, the more you do it, the easier, the more habitual, if you like, that behaviour can become. And you don't have to do it all of the time, but to get into a habit of trying to think about your food and those elements of eating can be really helpful in terms of focused eating. So how do we do this when life is busy, or when we're doing lots of other things, or maybe we eat in different places? And one of the ways that we can do this is to make some decisions before we eat that can really help us with engaging in mindful eating behaviours. So not doing anything else while you're eating, putting your phone down, maybe putting it somewhere where you can't see it, switching any screens off, not reading. So to try and create an environment where it's easier to focus on your food. And again, you don't have to do this all of the time to be a mindful eater. And actually, when you become a bit more practiced in mindful eating, you can eat very mindfully in a more distracted environment or in a busy environment. But certainly at the beginning, when you're starting to learn how to do this or starting to practice, it's really helpful to make those decisions, to create that space, if you like, to sit and really focus on the food that you're eating. So what we know, or what we've learned from the work that we've done, from the research that we've done, and from talking to people with CF and talking to clinicians, but mostly directly to people either in research projects where they've taken part in interviews, is that people often spend a lot of time thinking about food and eating. We know that people don't like filling in food diaries, that people aren't always very open about filling in food diaries, that people don't always like to write down everything that they're eating, that they feel sometimes that it kind of takes away autonomy, or that it takes away personal choice about what they're eating, and that maybe somehow the food diaries and what's written in them is a measure of how well you're adhering to treatments. And we know that people have often described a lack of pleasure in eating, that eating and your eating behaviours have been part of treatment for a long time, and it reduces pleasure in eating. That it's sometimes people have a long history of not really being able to respond to hunger and satiety cues. So satiety is just another word for fullness. Either being unaware of them or having to ignore or override them to eat enough food when you haven't been feeling very well, and really big descriptions of feelings of afraid of being judged, or feelings of shame or failure around eating behaviours. And that people have had a lot of strategies for eating, so not getting involved in food preparation, avoiding food preparation either if you're lucky enough to have somebody else who's cooking for you, or using takeout often to reduce that amount of the burden really of food preparation and eating. And that even when people feel really well or have been well for over a period of time, the fear of becoming unwell and the fear of losing weight remains really important for people. It's really hard to shake off that feeling that I might become unwell again and I might lose weight really quickly. And all of this and all of these personal experiences and all the reality of this can make it really difficult to relearn or unlearn or to learn new ways of eating or to change eating behaviours that have been lifelong habits. So it can be really challenging for people to change the way that they eat or to consider changing the way they eat. And even if people really want to change how they're eating, a lifetime of all of these experiences of linking eating food in a particular way to stay well and to stay healthy is really hard to shake off. When people eat in response to emotions, so for example, because they're stressed or they're anxious or bored, or sometimes even when you're happy or overwhelmed, the foods that we go for, so if you're feeling really stressed, we don't reach for a large salad. Usually we reach for high fat and sugar foods, chocolate, crisps. So these are the foods that people typically go for if they're eating in response to emotions rather than eating in response to hunger cues. And that eating in response to emotions doesn't always feel very pleasant. So people describe feelings of they don't enjoy the food as much, or they have very negative feelings after emotional eating. And we know that people with CF engage in emotional eating just the same way as anybody else does, and that it's linked to a higher BMI, which might not always be desirable. And really importantly, it doesn't really increase pleasure in eating, which is the aim. Eating is a social, in its best format, with without problems, is a sociable thing to do. It's something which should bring you pleasure. It's something that should be enjoyable, and emotional eating isn't always linked to an increase in pleasure in eating. So mindful eating or engaging in mindful eating can help to reduce emotional eating. So some decisions that can be made for thinking about mindful eating is to really think about choosing food that supports both your body and mind. So when we feel stressed or when we eat emotionally and we eat high fat or high sugar foods or highly palatable foods, really tasty foods, that we can think about that as eating in a way that can soothe your mind. It can be soothing, so it's supporting your mind. You feel less stressed. It's a stress response. It works. We know that it works in that moment. And if we think about eating for our bodies, or thinking about choosing food that can be kind to our bodies, not just kind to our minds, that's one way of thinking about eating food. Is this kind to my body? Is this being kind to my body? So trying to get that balance between eating food that is improving the way that you feel emotionally, but also is supporting your body health. Acceptance, not giving yourself a hard time about what you eat. So that, going back to what we talked about, or what I spoke about at the beginning about non-judgment. So really not giving yourself a hard time about what you eat or how you eat. There isn't a right or wrong way to eat your food. How you eat can be unique to you, but to really practice that self-kindness and really practice that not beating yourself up. Spending some time thinking about what you think about foods. Do I like this food? I don't like this food. I'm not actually bothered about this food. Sometimes we forget to really reevaluate, or we've never really evaluated how we feel about foods. We've got used to eating the same things, or we eat things because we've always eaten them, and we don't have an evaluation of actually, do I really like this or do I not like this? And really thinking about choosing food that supports health and well-being holistically for living with CF. So one of the practices that we have that we've developed that can really help, it's very simple, that can be used by everybody to increase that sensory experience and mindful attention of eating, is to think about and focus on 3 questions to consider when you're eating your food. So the 3 questions of how does it smell, how does it taste, and what's the texture of it. So you can have a sheet of paper in front of you, or you can just have these 3 questions on. You don't have to write anything down. You just focus your mind on these 3 questions. And to revisit the questions, to think about the beginning of the meal or a snack, and then revisit them during the meal, and keep your mind on these. And if your mind wanders off, you just acknowledge that and say, I just had a thought. Or if you just had a feeling, you acknowledge that, I just had a feeling, and then return to the 3 questions about how does my food taste or smell, or what's the texture of it. It sounds very simple, I know, and it can be simple. It can become more simple with practice. And then another practice that people can use is an assessment of hunger and satiety, to try and refocus responding to the physiological sensations of hunger, which is something that people might not be very practiced at, or they might have overridden those cues. And to look at, it's easier to do that when we look at a picture or a graph of rating our hunger. So here we have a graph rating hunger from extremely hungry at 1 through to very hungry, not feeling hungry, a little bit full, moderately full, very full. And to think, excuse me, where you are on that ratings, and what do I need to eat now. So if you're feeling slightly hungry, maybe you need a snack. If you're feeling very hungry at 2, or even extremely hungry at 1, maybe you've left it too long between eating, and to think about eating before you get to that point, because what we do when we're really, really hungry is we need to eat something really quickly. So we open the fridge and eat the leftover Easter eggs that your child hasn't got round to yet. That's you know, if you're too hungry to make decisions about what to cook and very hungry, you need to eat something quickly. So to think about eating food before you get to the point when you're very, very hungry. And the thing also for us to consider as working in this field is that not all aspects of mindful eating might be helpful all of the time for people with CF. So people might think that they already spend too much time focusing on food, or they don't want to think about food in this way, or they just want to focus on the pleasurable aspects of food. So we've developed another practice with people. We've had feedback from people to really get an idea about how identifying those pleasurable aspects of food which might be missing, and on self-regulating eating in a way that's adaptive, that you can regulate up or regulate down if needed. So in the work that I'm doing now, I've just started a series of workshops with healthcare professionals to lead discussions on mindful eating, and to give people an opportunity to evaluate the mindful eating practices that I've just been talking about. The practices are in video format, and people can use them. So if this is something that you might be interested in, you can get in touch or talk to your healthcare practitioner. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was a really, really interesting and useful introduction to mindful eating and cystic fibrosis. I can see a comment in the chat actually that it's really refreshing to know that these issues around food, etc., are felt by others with cystic fibrosis. So I'm going to hand over now to Katie as well.
Hi, yeah. So I work with adults in cystic fibrosis. And mindful eating is something we have started to do with some of our patients from information that's been given to us. We've had some education from Helen Egan as well, and we try and work towards people being more mindful. So I thought I'd spend my time talking more where clinically this would work with patients, and maybe where health professionals might start using it with people with CF, and then maybe in situations, maybe like Helen said, it's not always as helpful, and how we can adapt some of the knowledge we know from mindful eating to help people that maybe don't want to focus on their food as much. So ways where mindful eating has been maybe used in dietetics would be something around weight management, which is something we've been seeing more in CF, which I think Helen mentioned, in terms of people getting higher BMIs now and having to change the way that they've eaten from the past. Emotional eating, just like Helen said, and also can be used to help dietary management of CF diabetes as well. Because the one thing we know is there's a lot of areas within CF where thinking about eating can impact on your outcomes as well. So patients can use exactly the methods that Helen has spoken about, stopping, thinking about how you're eating. Also some practical things on sort of how you're feeling before you were eating. So to focus on the food at the time, but think maybe afterwards, oh, okay, so I ate that, how was I feeling at the time before I started eating it? And having a think overall of being mindful about when you're eating, how you're eating. Like Helen said, do I tend to eat away from the TV, or am I sat always in front of the TV? And then making a conscious effort to become more mindful in your practice if you're already not. Again, focusing on senses when you're eating, whether that's the taste or the smells, or whether, again, like Helen said, sometimes we know that everything doesn't taste right. For example, if you're on antibiotics or you're on certain medications, just make sure you're washing your mouth out if you're using medications that goes in your mouth, which might impact on your taste after you've used them. I'm really sorry if you can hear my dog, he's not well. And having to think about what fullness feels like to you. I think a lot of people can sometimes get the dietary advice of just stop eating when you're full, but what does that actually feel like? Do you feel full in your tummy? Do you start feeling it in your, if it's filling up, do you start feeling it in your lungs? I know a lot of people in CF, they can feel full quite quickly sometimes because of where the stomach's pushing on their lungs. So just pay close attention to that as well. I also think that mindfulness, in terms of a mindfulness practice, not necessarily mindful eating, can come when you're looking at planning your meals over time. So being mindful about the food choices you're making when planning what you're eating. If you know that you're going to be busier some days and you are trying to, say, work towards a healthy diet, being mindful, okay, Thursdays is swimming with the children, so I need to have something ready to go, and then you can have that mindful eating experience rather than running around trying to bath the kids, trying to shovel down some food at the time. If you set aside that time to have that mindful practice, you'll find it easier. That's easier said than done, I'm aware. And again, this is all through, I've written down, being kind to yourself, non-judgmental. I think a lot of people feel also that maybe when they do go and talk to their dietitian, they're telling them what they're eating, that we're judging as well. And I hope, and I'm sure none of the dietitians working with you and across the country will be judging you for what you're eating. We are as non-judgmental as we want you to be with yourself. There's no guilt attached to food. Food is food, it's fuel for us. It's just that some, again, like Helen said, is more nourishing for our bodies and our body health, and some is more nourishing for our mind and our enjoyment of life. And sometimes I say it's like mindful for your soul, nourishing for your soul. When it comes to emotional eating, I think a lot of teams in CF will have psychology attached to them. So your dietitians can work with you about making maybe some practical help around that, but do feel free to ask whether you can speak to your psychologists around dealing with the emotions as well. It's something the dietitians aren't experts in, so the psychologist can help you deal with those emotions maybe in a different way, whilst we support you with mindful eating as much as possible. I heard what Helen said about food diaries. Now I'm very much guilty of asking patients and people with CF to complete food diaries, and sometimes clinically we need those to assess your symptoms, whether that's asking how much creon that you take, or how the food is interacting with your insulin and your diabetes control. But do speak to your dietitians. We're not setting your homework, we're not your teachers, you don't need to do it, otherwise you'll be in trouble. We're doing it to help you. So if the way that we've asked you to do your food diary or completing a food diary is difficult for you, and it stops that mindful eating practice, speak to us. We can adapt, we can change the way that we're doing it, whether that's not even focusing on what you're eating, just taking a picture of it and forgetting about it. And then at the end of the time that we've asked you, you can send us the pictures. You've not had to focus on it, you've not had to write it down. Or you can add it to your mindful eating practice and focusing on what you are eating and writing it down, and maybe writing down some of the reflections that Helen said might help you and your team to see where different foods are eaten, where you're picking different foods, and help you to your goals. I think it goes into a mindful setting when you are thinking about your food. If you've got goals that you've set with your dietitian, whether that be to just start enjoying food more, or whether that to be removing any negative thoughts you have around food, or whether it be more of a clinical goal of getting to a certain weight or improving your bowel habits or your diabetes control, anything that you've set with them, making sure that you are still being kind to yourself. And also I like the phrase that Helen used, being kind to your body. Now, one thing I like to suggest is, rather than taking away foods that might be deemed less nourishing for you, is be kind to your body, be kind to your soul. If you need something comforting, and I don't know, a cheeseburger is your most comforting food, don't stop yourself having that cheeseburger, but think, what else can I add to make this more nourishing? Or what else can I add to make this sustain me for longer, so I feel fuller for longer? So for a cheeseburger, for example, you could add some salad into it, or you could serve it with some vegetables, or if it's something like chocolate, you can think, okay, how can I make this have a little bit more protein in it? Or could I serve chocolate covered fruit? And that's from the dietitian aspect of trying to help you make your diet more nourishing, if that's your goal. I'd also recommend you stepping back when you start mindful eating and think about what your preperceptions of food are. How do you feel about those certain foods? There's a lot of things out there that influence our views on foods. And I think the way that we as dietitians are working is changing all the time. So like I say, there's no good or bad foods. And I think out there in the media, there's a lot of talk around cheat days and clean or dirty food. And I mean, unless you've not washed your cabbage, none of the food is dirty. It's just for a different purpose. And being mindful about your preconceptions and where those fleeting thoughts come in, like Helen says, just park them. But then you can maybe go back and think, why was I thinking that? Like Helen said, mindful eating isn't for everyone. So actually sitting and focusing on your food isn't going to work if you're somebody that doesn't eat when you're stressed or doesn't eat when you're feeling unwell. Your chest symptoms can make you feel so poorly you might not want to eat. So that's the time to not focus on the food unless you're really going to focus on a pleasurable element of it, and just try and eat maybe in a more distracted environment at that time. But you can always come back to this mindful eating practice if it helps in the future, or if it works for you. So have a chat with your dietitians and your team and say, I've heard about this mindful eating, I think it would work for me in this way, or it would work for me in that way. And I think overall what we as dietitians is, we want you to have a positive relationship with food, and we want you to be as well nourished as we possibly can make you. That's our jobs. But first and foremost, we want you to have a positive relationship with your food and how you eat. And we know that actually sometimes we as dietitians are a big barrier to that. There's a lot of information that we give you on, even if it's from calcium, we're eating enough iron, and a lot of stuff to talk about. But we can support you in sort of stepping back from that and looking at you as a holistic perspective, looking at you as a whole and thinking, how can we help you enjoy food and be healthier at the same time. And then obviously we've got psychology there to help with the psychological side of it. If we as dietitians don't feel that we can give you the best advice, that I'm sure that they could, and they will have the time to work with you that over time, and hopefully we can work together to provide you with the best balance of enjoying food, being healthy, and being happy with your relationship with food as well. So yeah, I think it's so individual. I can't give anyone certain advice right now, but give it a go. From what Helen said, give it a try and have a chat with your team. And I'm sure that they'd be more than happy to support you with whatever your goals are in terms of your nutrition, and to help you just be healthy and happier in food. Because as a secret, all dietitians, we love food and we eat all foods. I've been on a training course with a bunch of dietitians today, and we were discussing how we eat all different foods, and sometimes we don't eat mindfully and sometimes we do. And sometimes it just depends on the situation, but we would encourage you to give it a go, ask us about it. It's a really encouraging part of research that's going on into food and the psychology behind it, which, yeah, is growing, and it's really great to see Helen's work with people with cystic fibrosis, because it is just slightly different. You've got a lot more to think about with your creon doses and your insulin dosage. Now you've got to eat with modulators if you take them, how food interacts with a lot of your medication. So it's not as easy as just do this and it will work. You do have a lot to consider, and you've got certain times you can and can't eat, and certain things you have to eat. So I'd suggest talking to your dietitian. They'll know the medications you're on, they'll know how you have to take them, and they can work with you to support you with your mindful eating journey if that's what you wanted to do. So that's roughly what I wanted to cover, but I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'm sure a lot of you have questions for Helen too.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was really interesting as well, and so many useful kind of tips and suggestions in there. I think it's a really good thing that we're recording this, because I'm sure people might want to go back and make some notes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to hear that this is kind of a growing area, and hopefully will become, you know, better understood and more prominent and practiced by people with CF, and also better understood within teams as well. So the chat is looking pretty quiet. So what I'm going to do is just come to some of the questions that we've had pre-submitted, if that's okay. And I think these, Katie or Helen, please feel free to both answer, or to take them in turn, whatever works best. So the first question that we've had is, how can adults with cystic fibrosis access support with good planning and keeping on track with calories, especially if this service is not always provided by dietetic teams?
Do you want me to say that one?
For you, Katie, I think.
That's fine. So there are different ways you can track your calories, whether that's apps that you want to use. Have a chat with your team. They can recommend some ones that might be accessible to you. I know different trusts have accessible ones they can use, or more general ones. What was the other half of the question? Sorry.
So keeping on track with calories and just good planning in general.
Good planning. So good planning is, like I mentioned, have a think forward in your week, in your day. Be aware that emotions may arise and your eating may not go as planned, and that is fine. But if you're working towards a goal, having a plan in place might help you just make those maybe healthier decisions if that's what you want to do. Writing a meal plan, shopping for it, having those foods in the house that you feel happy and confident to eat, that's fine. I'd say not over restricting or having any negative emotions around if you go over your calories one day, that's fine, because probably another day you're going to be under it. Don't sit too hard on it and don't worry too much. If you are going to have something that you might seen as a bad food in the past, don't tie emotions to that as much as possible and just enjoy that. And you know, another day you might have a snack you might deem as healthier. Everything normally works out in a balance. If you feel like it's unbalanced, that's maybe when you can have a chat with your dietitian and your team and work on maybe some areas that you could tweak it. But planning is one of the best ways. Speaking to your dietitians about foods that are more nourishing to meet your goal, whatever that may be, and planning those in, but then eating them mindfully as much as you can and enjoying that plan that you've made, rather than thinking, I'm going to lose weight, so I'm just eating salad. It's not sustainable. You want to have a plan that is also enjoyable and that you look forward to eating as well. I also wanted to add one more thing, and I think this might link with the cost of living crisis and the talk I did on eating on a budget. I think there's a lot of people that are worried about food waste and things like that, and they often then will pass that satiety cue that Helen spoke about. They'll go past that fullness because that's the food there, that's the food I need to eat. And I'd say my advice as a dietitian is have a box for leftovers there. It doesn't matter how small that one piece of leftovers is, whether it is one piece of pizza or it is half a roast dinner. If you're full at the time, respect that, put that food aside, and you can go back to it at any time. You might want it for supper later, or you might be able to take it for lunch the next day. So again, listen to your satiety cues. They're there from when you're born. Babies know when they're full of milk, and they stop. And it's just rebalancing that. And I think a lot of adults in this country have gone past that. I know I go to bed sometimes after going out and I feel poorly because I've eaten too much because I've gone past that cue. So it's just noticing that and bringing yourself back on a regular basis to feel that fullness. It's okay if you go past it once in a blue moon, but sticking to that on a regular basis will hopefully help you manage that mindfulness around your eating a little bit better.
Thank you, Katie. So we've had a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat or not, so I'll read them out. But do you find that CF adults over 20 have more struggles with food, as it was such a pressure for them to put weight on compared to maybe children with CF who are growing up now?
I would probably say, yeah, I think my transition patients that are coming through probably are still coming from that sort of eat as much as you can. I do feel like give us 15 years and it's going to be so different. Pediatric dietitians now, if patients are on modulators, the advice is healthy eating, and they might go into more of this mindful eating earlier, whereas we are finding adults, like Helen mentioned, that change in eating is very different, and a lot of people, they didn't find enjoyment in food when they're pressured to eat it. They were so unwell that food didn't taste right. I'm sure Helen's come across this in her research as well.
Yeah, for sure that that eating, I mean, I think it's when you're under so much pressure to eat, and when you feel like you're being so heavily monitored about what you're eating with very good physical health reasons for that, and a very kind of holistic caring approach that each, you know, the messages from that, you know, yesterday I was talking to healthcare professionals and saying, you know, the advice was eat. And now to think about regulating eating in a completely different way, and really, Katie, just you said, to kind of to lose those psychological or emotional attachments to food as being, you know, it's safe to eat a lot of food. I'm in a safer place. If I eat more, I need to keep eating more. I need to keep myself safe. I need to keep myself well. This is the thing that I can do, even when it's really difficult to kind of go beyond. You know, we didn't talk about hunger and satiety. It talked about getting to a goal of eating enough food by the end of the day. What can you do at the end of the evening if you haven't reached that calorie count? If you haven't reached those, okay, what can I eat late at night that's not going to make me feel sick? Unlearning all of that, we really shouldn't underestimate what it's like to unlearn all of that. Any of us who've been on an all-you-can-eat holiday or an all-you-can-eat, you know, where the food is readily available and prepared, and we lose our ability very quickly to respond to hunger cues and to regulate our eating in the way that we would. Christmas time, you know, if you go, you're saying about moving out from your parents, you know, we eat for so many different reasons, even with or without a health condition. We eat because it's Christmas, because it's a celebration, because somebody you love has cooked it for you, because we're happy, because we're unhappy, because we're at a wedding, because it's Easter. Most of the reasons that we eat are not related to physiological cues, or most of the reasons for the food that we eat are lightly related to physiological cues. So even without the learning that you've had around eating, it's hard for people to refocus on that eating. We eat, you know, because we don't want someone to feel upset that we're not eating their food. We eat because, you know, we don't want food waste. We want to finish what's on our plate. We eat because the food tastes nice, even when it stops tasting nice. You know, that first bite of something delicious is wonderful, and the second is lovely, and the third is okay. And then when you're onto the 9th, 10th, 12th bite of it, it doesn't have that same satiating feeling. But we don't eat. Babies do. Like you say, Katie, we know from experiments with babies and toddlers that left to their own devices without any social cues around food, they eat, you know, relative, you know, quite balanced. But we're out of that. We're social creatures, and eating is a social behaviour. So yeah, I don't have the answers apart from kind of focusing on the hunger, maybe using that scale to really to measure to think about it, to really focus your mind and thinking about it, and acknowledging to yourself, being really kind to yourself that, you know, this is going to be hard. It is going to be hard. And yeah, for younger children who aren't having to grow up with these different food messages, maybe it will be different, but right here, right now, it's hard.
Yeah. And this person, as you just mentioned, has mentioned sort of only just starting to enjoy food since taking Kaftrio, but struggling to identify when they are hungry and actually just forgetting to eat. And as you mentioned, moving away from home, are there any kind of simple tips potentially that just to not just to remind you to be mindful when you're eating, but just to remember to eat, full stop?
I mean, I guess you can be really pragmatic about it, and you could actually set an alarm on your clock, or you could make sure, like Katie says, that you have snacks in the house that you can eat, so that when you do realise you're hungry, you can eat something really quickly. To remember some of those things that you have learned and you do know. You know, we know that as a group of people, you are exceptionally knowledgeable about food and nutrition and what you need to eat. You know, in all the interviews I've ever done with people, I am really, you know, taken aback still now after nearly 10 years with people's knowledge of food. You don't lack the knowledge. So it's just the practice bit of it maybe now has got to change a bit. So yeah, keep a lunchbox in your bag, keep some things with you, and brilliant that you're enjoying food or finding the pleasure in food, and don't underestimate the benefit of that is, you know, with the work that we're doing now, not just in this population, but in weight management populations and in other populations with students who have a lot of those pressures about living away from home from the first time, living on a budget, trying to negotiate their own social cues around eating. Forgotten what I was going to say now. That's not helpful, is it? But you know that there are things that you can learn and that you can do, but the social aspect and the pleasurable aspects of eating are crucially important, and yeah, relish it if you can.
Thank you. So we'll come back to some of our questions that we've had pre-submitted. So somebody has said, do you have any advice for small beginner steps to go from binge eating during low mood towards more mindful eating? And this person says they've struggled for several years now as a CF diabetic and would be really grateful for any suggestions.
Katie?
Yeah, so I'd say the first thing is to remove the guilt around the binge eating and acknowledge why that's happening, what it is you go for, and the fact that you've even brought that question up shows that you're at the place where support can be given. One thing I would say is definitely try and access your psychology services, or have a chat with somebody that's not necessarily the clinical dietitian about this, that can listen and understand, or maybe help to support ways to manage that emotion differently. As dietitians, we can help you with the nutritional side of it. We could maybe have a chat with you around, you know, that adding nourishment to your foods. If you do feel, you know, when you are sad, something comforting is what you need, and if that's more often than not, that can lead to, you know, weight gain, high calorie intake. How could we help you make those comforting meals a little bit more nourishing but still feel as comforting? And addressing the psychology behind the binge eating, I think, is key. As dietitians, we are limited in that sort of psychological approach, but having a chat with the psychologists as well, just to see what you can do around managing your thoughts and your feelings around that. And again, it's hard because at the time that you're binge eating, your emotions are going to override all your satiety cues. They're going to override all of your balanced eating thoughts. So it's almost addressing that as well as then trying to bring in the mindful eating. If you do start to binge and halfway through you're noticing it, try and bring in those mindful thoughts. Try and think, okay, am I feeling good with what I'm eating? Is it making me feel good? Do I like the taste of it still? Is this bite of chocolate as good as the first bite I had? Or actually, am I now feeling a bit sick? And that might help you stop that binging behavior in the time. But overall, we need to look holistically at why that's happening and what we can do to support you as a CF team to help you manage the emotional side of it too.
Yeah, and we know that self-compassion at that point, self-kindness and self-compassion, so that if somebody has engaged in eating behaviours that they think are either binge eating or they've eaten in a way that they're not happy with themselves about eating. So when people have been following a particular eating behaviour pattern which is healthy, or they think is healthy, or they feel good about, and then they fall off the wagon. So diets, when you diet break, you know, invariably you're going to come off that diet at some point. That actually a self-compassionate intervention at that point in time, in that moment when that diet is broken. So it can be loving kindness meditation, or it can just be, you know, reading something positive about yourself that you've written, or something really helps with that, with stopping that behavior there, so that you can get back to the kind of eating behaviors that make you feel better. What doesn't help is guilt and shame. Those things really, really don't help, because you're in the spiral then of feeling rubbish about yourself, beating up on yourself. And if you're already eating in response to negative emotions, heaping more negative emotions on that isn't going to help matters. So that being kind to yourself and thinking, you know, that reflection afterwards. But definitely after that food eating episode is finished, is not the time to give yourself a hard time. It's to think about, what can I do differently? What do I feel? What do I need right now that maybe You know, I mean, the ways that people have described to us about being kind to themselves vary so hugely. Some people it is a large, you know, something chocolate, large glass of wine. Other people describe it as going to the gym or going for a run. And then we have kind of neutral behaviours in the middle, like having a bath, lighting a candle, etc. But trying to refocus when I'm feeling these feelings, I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling lonely. First of all, trying to identify that feeling. What do I feel right now? Actually, and we're not good at that. We really are not very good at that. I'm having a feeling, or you're eating or drinking before you know that you're having that feeling. What am I feeling right now? What do I feel right now? Do I feel sad? Do I feel lonely? Do I feel angry? Do I feel overwhelmed? I think that's the biggest feeling that a lot of people have, particularly in busy lives. And recognizing that feeling, even if you don't know what to do with it, just recognizing I'm having a feeling. What am I actually feeling? What do I need right now? Shower, duvet, something else away from food. And again, not easy. I don't say it lightly. I don't say it as a panacea. It's not easy, but getting into the habit maybe of asking yourself that question, what am I feeling right now?
Thank you. It's really helpful. I think we've got time for one more question, if that's okay. So this is about people's perceptions and comments on diet. So this person said, I obviously eat a high-fat diet and I work in a hospital. My colleagues don't know about my condition and make comments about my eating habits and how unhealthy I am, which sounds pretty tough to deal with. I'm becoming quite self-conscious and it's taken me a lot to actually sit and eat in public because I've always had a tough relationship with food. Do you have any suggestions about what this person could say and do?
I have a few things that I can think that they could say to people about minding their own business, but that's probably not entirely helpful. I think it's a really difficult one, and I think it's really hard that people feel that they have that it's okay to comment on what other people are eating. And I think it comes from these social constructs around what is what people should and shouldn't be eating, and maybe those comments are meant well in terms of, oh, you can eat this sort of food. We've had a lot of people say it's difficult to deal with comments when people say, oh, you're so slim but you eat all of this junk food, and people may not mean it negatively. They may mean it in a kind of, oh, you can eat what you want. And there's this kind of underlying message that comes across as judgment there, but it is judgment from other people, or it feels like judgment from other people. Yeah, it's difficult. Eating is social. We do it socially, and that self-consciousness when we're eating. We have a lot of people who describe in weight management when they're a larger weight, that they have those same feelings of not wanting to eat in public. I'm struggling a bit here, Katie. I don't know whether you've got just self-kindness, self-compassion, and
I think again, it really depends on your relationship with the people that are saying it to you as well. So if it was somebody that you could trust, you could address it with them. This sounds like it's a work colleague situation, so it could be somebody above them at work that's saying this, or if it's a peer, I guess it's considering at the time, is this something I could address with someone? Just say, not even disclosing a condition or anything, or you could just say, actually, I do have to eat like this. Can we not mention my food? Yeah, just say it's for my health, or I am healthy, and just try and say, look, I've noticed you've commented about my lunch a few times. That actually makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. Really, can we just not do that? And again, that's a position where you've got to trust the person you're talking to, and that's not an easy discussion to have. That's not an easy discussion to have with anybody, never mind someone at work. I guess it really depends on how you feel at that time. But I mean, I will challenge people's perceptions, even in my own circles. Sometimes there are such perceptions of food, and are you going to eat all of that? There's no way you're going to eat all that pizza. And I'm like, well, I am, because I'm hungry and I've come out for my pizza. So I guess I'm a lucky person being a dietitian sometimes to challenge people on that, because I know my things, but you are an expert in you. You are your expert. You know far more about your dietary needs than anybody. Not even your dietitian knows you as well as you know yourself. So just backing yourself, and if you do have the time, confidence, or even the chance to say something, it might help you. It's a really hard situation.
And to know that you're not alone. A lot of people feel very self-conscious about what they eat in terms of other people's responses, and it might not be, you know, but lots and lots of people describe exactly what you're saying. When other people comment about their food for whatever reason, it makes them feel uncomfortable and it makes them not want to eat in public. So this is absolutely not a you problem. This is absolutely a them problem. And to know that what you're experiencing, I think most people would feel the same way as you do. So just to be assured really that you're not being oversensitive, you're not responding, you're not overreacting. And if you do decide to say something, it's possible that people are just being oversensitive or you're reacting. You're absolutely not.
And someone's commented in the chat, I'm eating mindfully and there are no good and bad foods. Sound like very good responses.
Yeah. Maybe have those responses, actually literally write them down and have them to hand. That's a really good one. You know, if mind your own business doesn't work for you, then actually having these responses and writing them down so that you've got them, because in that moment it's really hard to think. You only think about what you want to say when you've walked away. So yeah, that's a really, really good idea.
And I think both of those are almost a slight education for other people. I think other people are only projecting their own thoughts and feelings about how they see food. So that person that's saying either, oh, you eat loads of high fat food, or, oh, that's not a lot of food, they're probably projecting how they feel about their relationship with food. So I'm eating mindfully, or there are no good or bad foods. You've got to be ready. That might come back with questions. They might be like, what even are you talking about? Of course there's bad food, or what does mindful eating mean? So if you're confident enough to have a response, just be ready that they might ask you questions, but know that, you know, you're right when you say that. And a lot of health professionals, research professionals like Helen can agree that those statements are correct. It's just the population view of those has been skewed over time.
Great, thank you. And just a last point, if people do want to discuss mindful eating with their CF teams, and perhaps they aren't as familiar with it as you both are, potentially they could direct them, Helen, to you to find out a bit more about your study and taking part in that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And are there any kind of resources or anything out there, or is it a bit of a kind of specialist area? I know you mentioned it's difficult to provide advice in this kind of setting, but are there any kind of broad resources?
So I mean, if you Google mindful eating, you're going to have there's so much information that it's hard to know where to start. And I can't vouch for all the quality of the information that's on there. And some mindful eating goes kind of into different areas, or potentially doesn't really stick to the principles of mindful eating. So the work that we're doing at the moment is just starting to put together, mindful eating resources that are specifically directed for people with CF, with the view that they come with a very specific, with a history of eating differently, with that flexibility of maybe you might need to regulate up at some times and regulate down at other times. So we're looking, so these are being evaluated at the moment. As soon as we're working as quick as we can within the NHS ethics, etc. And once these have been evaluated as being helpful, or certainly not causing any issues for people with CF, then they will be available. But it's likely to be some months. Having said that, within the UK at least, if you speak to your healthcare professionals and tell them, or give them the information, or my name or anything, or Katie's name, Katie can, and then we can get that team involved and make those resources available for that team.
Great. Well, it sounds like they'll be incredibly useful to have in due course when they're ready. Fantastic.
Hopefully.
Well, thank you very much. That brings us to 8 o'clock. So I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed, Helen and Katie, for coming along and sharing all your expertise. I feel like I've learned a huge amount this evening. I'm sure those on the call have as well. And there's people in the chat who've commented on how useful they found it. So thank you very much again. And as I mentioned, the recording will be shared, so you can watch it back on YouTube in a few days and catch up in any areas you might have missed. So I think we are going to share some details about our upcoming events now. And also, I believe my colleague Nicola is going to pop a feedback questionnaire in the chat. So if you'd like to share any feedback on this evening's event, please do so. It helps us to improve our future events and make them as useful and relevant as possible. So if you have a few minutes, that would be really appreciated. And as I mentioned, we've got one more event coming up in our nutrition series. So that will be around gut health, and that's taking place on the 23rd of May. Excuse me, and you can register for that at the moment. The link is below, cysticfibrosis.org.uk/CF Live. And also I'd just like to highlight that we have a session coming up on our genetic therapies, which is being led by our research team, and they'll be sharing some information about genetic therapy trials and also some new resources that we have available. So please do come along to that if that's of interest, and the registration will be open for that soon. So keep an eye on our website, or you can register for our newsletters as well to hear the latest on all of our events. So I think that's everything for this evening, but thank you again to our speakers, and thank you all very much for coming this evening and for your comments and questions in the chat. I hope you've all found it really useful, and we hope to see you again soon.